with a clear tribute to a second colleague that we've lost this week in Tony Benn. So I'm just going to use this opportunity to ask Lindsey, the convener of the Stop the War Coalition and a signatory to the People's Assembly, of course, a lifelong activist, to pay tribute to Tony Benn. Lindsey.
Thank you very much, and I think it's a very sad day. Jeff has talked very eloquently about Bob Crow and about both of them, and I just want to say a little bit about Tony Benn, who many of you I think knew personally or had spoken to personally. He spoke at so many hundreds of meetings up and down the country. He was a very, very good friend to the Stop the War Coalition, which he was in from the very beginning, and to the Coalition of Resistance, which we formed a few years ago against austerity. And then when we formed the People's Assembly last year, again, he was one of the people who was there right from the very beginning. He would, of course, have been here today had he still been with us. And one of the last speeches that he made was in this hall on November 30th of last year, when we had a Stop the War conference. And as usual with Tony Benn, he had to have an escort to get him out of the building, because there were so many, hundreds of people would queue up to ask him questions, ask him to come and speak, get him to sign books, all of those other things. And it is obviously such a huge loss for our whole movement and for everything that we stand for that Tony is no longer with us. And there have been many tributes paid to him, although, and I'll speak about in a minute, there have also been, I think, some fairly unpleasant, attacks on him since he died. But I think the most remarkable thing about Tony Benn is that, counterintuitively, as they always say, he was somebody who moved to the left as he got older, something that they always tell you is never going to happen. He came from a relatively privileged and well-off family, but he identified himself always with the cause of socialism and with the people who were some of the poorest and the most oppressed. He always was a great internationalist. He spoke about meeting Mahatma Gandhi when he was a child, because his father was also involved in anti-colonial activities back in the 1930s. And he was a great supporter of all of those things. He made a decision, and I think the most important thing he did in his life, really, and no doubt this won't be the main thing, his obituaries, but I think the most important things he did were the things that he did in the last phase of his life, because he was a successful politician. He was very well known as a cabinet minister and a Labour MP, and he nearly had the terrible fate of spending 5 decades in the House of Lords, which he fought very, very hard not to have to do. But I think the most impressive thing about him was that when his wife Caroline died in 2000, and he was absolutely devoted to Caroline, he obviously took a very important decision that for the rest of his life he wasn't going to just be sitting in Parliament, that he was going to be campaigning, and he made the very famous comment that he was leaving Parliament in order to spend more time with politics. And that was exactly what he did. And all of you will know that he was somebody who would come and speak, who would be at all the demonstrations, and who articulated, I think, the thoughts of millions of people. You know, when you have mainstream politics, where all the mainstream politicians say more or less the same about austerity and about all of these things, Tony Benn was somebody who stood up against the stream and said the truth, and that was something that millions of people appreciated and millions of people understood what it was that he was saying. And he was a very good friend in particular to Stop the War, and I mean, it wasn't always easy to do. He was somebody who, the day of the bombings in London in 2005, when we had those terrible bombings, he was somebody we phoned, and he immediately agreed to speak at a meeting about how we were against the bombings, but we were also against the wars which we believed had created the conditions for terrorism in Britain and elsewhere. He went on the BBC, there was a great interview with him on the BBC, one of the best, when the BBC refused to broadcast the Disasters Emergency Fund appeal for the people of Gaza when they were being bombed by Israel. And he was so angry. I've never seen him as angry as he was then. And he actually broadcast the details of it, despite the BBC journalists trying to stop him from doing so. And one final example is after Gordon Brown became Prime Minister, they thought they could crack down more on anti-war demonstrations. Indeed, they did. They banned the demonstration that we wanted to have from Trafalgar Square down to Whitehall. Tony Benn phoned me up and said, I've just delivered a letter to Downing Street protesting about this ban. I'm a member of the Privy Council, you know, so they had to take some notice of him, so I've only barely been aware, frankly, that he was a member of the Privy Council. But he was very, very angry, and so I've told Gordon Brown that I'm going to march from Trafalgar Square to Whitehall wearing my Second World War medals, and I will do so whether the police stop me or not. And that is exactly what we did. We assembled in Trafalgar Square, he brought his medals with him, and funnily enough, the police let us march without He was actually the finest of activists. He was somebody, if you're ever organising a campaign, he's exactly the sort of person that you would want. He was extremely polite, he was extremely helpful, he was extremely disciplined about what he did. He would turn up on demonstrations with his little folding chair that he had later in life, so he didn't have to stand up all the time, with his flask of tea, with his pipe, and with his cheese sandwich, because he was vegetarian and teetotal and not very interested in those kind of things. If you went for a pizza with him, which was one of his favourite meals, it was always the cheapest margarita that he chose, no fancy rocket or anything else on the pizza. He was a fantastic man, and of course his contribution wasn't just speaking. He wrote his diaries, which were a great record of post-war political history here in Britain, and very, very interesting. I must say I'm fairly disgusted by some of the stuff in The Guardian. I think is quite remarkably bad, the coverage today. And the BBC last night, you had Shirley Williams, who hated him back from the 1980s, and who blamed him for splitting the Labour Party, although, as I remember, it was Shirley Williams who left the Labour Party. Anyway, I'm going to write a letter to The Guardian. If you want to add your name to it here, complaining about this, please send an email to Stop the War and we'll include all your names. Final point is this. His legacy, there's a great many memories we have, but the legacy, when anybody dies like this, is not just about the past, it's about the present and about the future. And what we're doing here today is dedicating ourselves to changing the world, and Tony Benn and Bob Crow will have been very, very proud of us doing that. One very final point, one of the last conversations I had with him, he said that he thought May Day this year should be a day of a kind of uprising against austerity. I think that we need to try and think of ways to make. But anyway, I'm going to write a letter to The Guardian. If you want to add your name to it here, complaining about this, please send an email to Stop the War and we'll include all your names. Final point is this. His legacy, there's a great many memories we have, but the legacy, when anybody dies like this, is not just about the past, it's about the present and about the future. And what we're doing here today is dedicating ourselves to changing the world, and Tony Benn and Bob Crow will have been very, very proud of us doing that. One very final point, one of the last conversations I had with him, he said that he thought May Day this year should be a day of a kind of uprising against austerity. I think that we need to try and think of ways to make